now gonna jump into the Q&A. Happy to have with us here Yasmina Price, the guest curator of the season, and Amy Sall. Yasmina is a New York-based writer and film programmer completing a PhD at Yale. She is devoted to visual culture from the African continent and diaspora, anti-colonial cinema, and the experimental work of women filmmakers. Her programming has been featured at Anthology Film Archives, Light Industry, Maisels, eFlux, Brooklyn Academy of Music, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Pan-African Film and Arts Festival, Los Angeles, and her writing has appeared in edited volumes in museum catalogs with Essays in the Nation, The Baffler, Mooby's Notebook, Hammer and Hope, Criterion's Current, Film Quarterly, and World Records Journal. Amy Sall is a writer, independent researcher, and collector archivist based in New York. She is the author of The African Gaze, Photography, Cinema, and Power, which you can pick up in our bookshop, and which was published by Thames and Hudson in 2024. Amy is also the founding editor of SUNU, Journal of African Affairs, Critical Thought and Aesthetics, a Pan-African post-disciplinary platform exploring the artistic, cultural, and intellectual production of Africa and the diaspora across time and space. As former adjunct faculty at the New School, she conceived and taught 2 courses, The African Gaze, Visual Culture of Post-Colonial Africa, and The Social Imagination, and Third Cinema and the Counter-Narratives. Amy's work and interests explore the theory and praxis of cultural sovereignty, cultural preservation, and anti-de and post-coloniality, human rights, visual culture, and the archive. All right, let's jump in.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Danny, for the warm welcome, and it is always such an honor to be in a place of Black culture for Black people. And I couldn't be happier than to be joined by, you have to call her the Amy Sall, you do, because as you can hear from the bio, we could not be in better hands. And for those of you who already have a copy of her book, The African Gaze, or who might have seen it, I think it's both being in a place and in kinships with people who are really committed to honoring the work of our Afro-diasporic and continental past. So I'm really grateful you're here.
The honor is truly mine, Yasmina. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this incredible, beautiful program. Just another banger of a cinematic program. And thank you to the Schomburg, thank you to Daniela for organizing this so beautifully. And I echo your sentiments. It is incredible and amazing to be in a space, the home for Black intellectual thought, artistic production, research, study. And this place has served an incredible purpose for me in the making of my book. So this is, it's an honor to be here. And Yasmina, thank you for your endless, critical, important work that you do. So happy to be here. Oh, yes. Before we start this conversation, I just want to take a minute to acknowledge the passing of the late Dr. Mbaye Cham, who was a scholar, a professor at Howard University. He dedicated decades of his life to Howard. I think that it is impossible to talk about Black cinema, to talk about African cinema without recognizing him and his incredible and valuable contributions. He passed last month. The memorial was just held this past weekend at Howard University, and so I think in the spirit of Sembène, of Fanon, of the colonial thought, of talking about liberation and African cinema, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment to acknowledge him. So, yeah, and thank you all for being here.
And really, really do stand on many, many shoulders. And for those of you who might be familiar with his work or not, he wrote a book in 1992 called Exiles, Essays on Caribbean Cinema, and it remains the reference book for Caribbean film. And I think as will have been reminded through Isaac Julien's stunning Frantz Fanon film, is that while Fanon ended up dedicating much of his life to the Algerian Revolution, he was Martinican. Sembène was from Senegal, but both of them were dedicated to a Black internationalist, Pan-African project of liberation, which I think especially when we are in a present that is so constrained by borders and violence and fragmentation, to be reminded of these histories that were always about this work of reconnecting our peoples who were uprooted, separated through systems of violence that are unfortunately still very much with us, but that there was this work where you could be a Martinican dedicating your life to the Algerian revolutionary struggle, and that there would still be so many teachings in those works. And maybe just to say a little bit about the logic of the program, because it could seem obvious, and maybe this could also seem like a little bit of a strange pairing. And one of the things that was really at the heart of it was thinking about confinement and containment, about what it means to be stuck in place. And obviously that's so much Joanna's life in La Noire 2, but then also someone like Frantz Fanon, who really thought about the violence of colonization as something that passes through our bodies, but also something that's done to the land and to how we are allowed to be in space. And so that we have this experience of claustrophobia on the one side, and then this experience of conquest on the other. And then I would say that where Fanon remains a really valuable resource for all of us is because he was a medical doctor. So what he was doing was a kind of diagnosis, was a kind of work of explaining and exposing and demystifying and giving us the kind of tools we need to understand our conditions of unfreedom in order to figure out how to get free. And then there's maybe the slightly more obvious connection between his work in the texts of Black Skin, White Mask and the mask in La Noire 2, so that we have this process of unmasking, of seeing the underneath of colonization, the underneath of what it means to be a Black person in the colonial world. And then we also have the idea of a mask as both an object, but also as a way that you are in a world that is unable to recognize you, because part of the claustrophobia of La Noire 2 is not just the fact that she is stuck in that apartment all the time, but the fact that she is with people who cannot see her in any capacity. She might as well be that silent mask. And I know that Sembène is a filmmaker that you have studied, research, whose memory you've upheld.
Yeah, this pairing was it unlocked some things I had not thought about before. As I was preparing for our talk and rewatching the films, there were some connections that I had not made before, and that Frantz Fanon provides the framework, the theory, the language, and Sembène's Black Girl provides the embodied visual of what Fanon is talking about. In Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon talks about the zone of non-being, which is this space where the depersonalized self, the colonized subject, is just inundated with psychological, or is feeling the psychological trauma, the psychosomatic trauma, which is violence that stems from colonialism. And we see Joanna going through the psychological, the psychosomatic trauma. And so it was interesting watching these two films because because Fanon provided the framework, whereas Sembène sort of gives us the meat and potatoes and allows us to visualize what that psychological trauma in the body of the colonized self looks like. You know.
And I think where who Fanon was as a thinker, as a revolutionary, but also who Sembène was as a thinker and a revolutionary, we really see in the narrative of Joanna's life, because on the one hand, the reason she finds herself in those kinds of labor conditions is because of the ties of dependencies that are created between France as a colonial power and Senegal as a newly independent, but still dependent state, and that there's the way it's operating at that level, but also because Fanon himself was really interested in cinema, and Black Skin, White Mask is the text where he talks about it the most. He both talks about his experience as a Black person in the colonial metropole, going to the movie theater and just waiting. That's what he says, is I waited to see myself. He's waiting. But obviously in what he also thinks about as the kind of unconscious of colonial white cinema, a full Black person can't actually appear. You're never there. And I think there's something too with how Diwana is at first also looking to European magazines as a way to understand herself. And I remember you saying something really interesting about her change of appearance, right?
Oh yeah, I was referring to, there's a part in the film where, well, there's not necessarily a part, but we eventually see her without the wig. And there isn't a distinct moment where she removes the wig, but the Diwana without the wig is embodying this idea of a refusal. Like, she has come to see the light. She understands the truth of what reality is in the colonial metropole. She's no longer wanting to assimilate. She's wanting to reclaim the self that has been lost through her experience. Like, she doesn't even know who she is. In the film, she asks, am I just a maid? Am I just here to watch the kids? Like, she's literally questioning, who am I? What am I doing? And so this removal of the wig is sort of like trying to reclaim any bits of herself that she has lost along the way. But I kind of want to jump, forgive me if I'm like doing a little bit of a jazz here, but just thinking about the connections between Fanon and Sembène, because they both sort of come into their political awakening in France during World War II. They both serve on behalf of the French. Sembène served as part of the Senegalese Tirailleurs, whereas Fanon served, I believe, as part of the French Free Forces. But it was after that experience in the war in France when the seeds were planted for what would become their life's work, because they understood the hypocrisies, the contradictions of France. They understood that it made no sense to fight for liberté, égalité, fraternité when that was not extended to them as Black folks. And so this was another connection that I had not realized until I watched these two films in tandem. And it's interesting that, like, some of their most crucial, quintessential work came out of that experience of being in the war, being in France. And Black Girl is a continuation of earlier works from Sembène. Black Girl is a filmic sort of continuation of his first film, Le Docker Noir, or The Black Docker, which is sort of autobiographical because it talks about dock work in Marseille, and after the war, Sembène took up dock work in Marseille. He was an organizer. He was trying to awaken the political consciousness of his fellow Black African Caribbean people in Marseille. And that work was born out of an earlier work called Liberté, which was this long poem. And so for Sembène, he just kept pushing the ways to make the message felt, make the message known, to find ways to express the truth, the reality of the colonial or post-colonial condition in France.
Absolutely. And I think in the same way that it matters to think about their trajectories as this ongoing arc of work, I think it also, bound up in that too, is also thinking about why these films get made and what's behind, because now Sembène and Isaac Julien are both very much recognized as, I mean, Sembène colloquially called the father of African cinema. I think it should be the uncle, because there's a bunch of them. And Isaac Julien also is a single standalone artist, but both of them actually come out of very much collective forms of work. Sembène starts making films when the camera finally enters into the hands of Africans, and this is part of an entire Pan-Africanist project. They create FEPAKI. These are all these filmmakers that are working together, and Isaac Julien similarly, although he's not, so Sembène, it's the 60s, 70s in Senegal on the African continent. With Isaac Julien, it's in the UK, it's the Black British 1980s creation of independent Black cinema, but he's also coming out of workshops, and he's also coming out of collectives. And I think there's something in the profound commitment of that kind of political, cultural work, which is not just located in the thing you see on the screen, but has everything to do with the way they go about their work. And I think similarly with with what is on the screen, but what is not necessarily either the narrative content or exactly what happens in the films, but the kind of language that they use. Because even though in the story of what's happening in La Noire de Joanna is so dispossessed, she suffers horribly, she is so minimized. If you look at what the camera is doing, the camera is telling you the exact opposite. She's very much the center of the frame. The camera is adamantly giving her this kind of dignity and this kind of centrality that, fine, she doesn't have it with this horrible white couple, but she has it with Sembène, and even the way the camera lingers so much on her face is that we know that she is a full person, and the film in its visual language is telling us that.
Yeah, and I think there's something interesting about the camera being centered on her, because I think when we were talking about this earlier, it's like, yes, to make a point that she's stunning, like that cannot be ignored, but also to humanize her, because as a viewer, we are able to see the highs and the lows. Like, we see her being so excited to get this job in France, you know, j'ai du travail chez les Blancs, like she's running through, you know, her neighborhood screaming this. We get to see the excitement, and through the camera being positioned on her the entire way, we see the excitement, we see the dips, we see the trauma, we see the pain, we see the sadness, like because Sembène is forcing us or reminding us that despite what colonialism or post-colonialism attempts to do, this is still a person with emotions, and the viewer are going to see every rise and fall of what she's going through. We owe her that much.
Which is why the value of these films is also that they give us, they're both speaking in a particular visual language, but they also offer us the opportunity of almost a kind of a different literacy in how we read images and how we understand visual information and what is given to us. Because now, compared to definitely when Sembène was making films, but even when Isaac Julien and the Black Audio Collective were making films, we have so much more technology at our disposal. It is so much more immediate, but it still means that we are in a time where you can document the minutia of an ongoing genocide over 2 years. But the fact that we can document the fact that Palestinians are being ethnically cleansed doesn't actually immediately translate into a kind of political work. And I think the legacy in all of this was also really finding ways that we can't confuse our cultural work for exactly being political. There are meaningful differences in how we engage in all of this, but the fact that it's both understanding how each part works that makes sure that we're able to leverage everything. Because I think what can also feel at times maddening as a Black person who was alive in 2020 and who remembered the kind of opening that we had, where it seemed like a kind of Black liberation was being performed on the street every day, was in our institutions, was in our homes. And then 5 years later, you think, well, where did that go? And I think that part of it does happen when our visual literacy, the way we use media, the way we understand cultural work is actually the opposite of what happens at a place like the Schomburg, where it's actually like, this is in the building, this is in the people who are served by this institution. But when you have the other side of something which just gives us like a surface image of you might be free, but you're actually getting your unfreedom sold back to you in a different way. And then this is the instruction in these films, is that we need to look at how we're being shown things and not just the words or the images.
Yeah, and Isaac Julien's film, I think, is a reminder to study, to get back into the stacks of the library, to read the books, to go through the archives. I mean, clearly, this film relies a lot on archival imagery. I mean, it's a very textured film. There's the archival imagery, there's the very classic documentary style interviews, there's the reenactments, but I think Julian Isaac, that was very Isaac Julian's use of the archive is just a reminder, like, these materials are available, like, this for us to look to use, to study, and to see how this could be of use in our works, in our, intellectual expansions. And I think his film is also echoing and speaking to the larger, tradition of Black British cinema. I mean, John Akomfra, the Black Audio Film Collective, even younger filmmakers like Jen Nkuru and most recently Akinole Davies, they are relying on, or not relying, but they are making use of the archive in their works. And so I think it's just a reminder, like, the material is out there for us, especially, we're in the Schomburg, is home to an incredible archive. I think I mentioned earlier, I leaned on this archive to write my book. I mean, it's just, there are invaluable resources at our disposal, and I think we need to get back to doing that groundwork. Because filmmakers like Sembène, they were very much about laying the groundwork. And we were talking about how we put the title or the name revolutionary on our filmmakers, but these filmmakers, they didn't, people like Sembène did not consider themselves to be revolutionaries. They considered themselves to be doing their part, to be laying the groundwork, to study, to talk to people, to be with the people, to be for the people. And I think watching these films, engaging with these thinkers, engaging with these filmmakers are just welcomed reminders, like, there's work to be done and the work is never finished. And I'm not gonna read it, but there is a quote that I brought because I was like, I might wanna read this in front of people, but I'm just gonna summarize. Sembène said, the work of revolution is not to get it done, but to get it started. And revolutionary work, memory work, cultural work, it's an ongoing thing, and we all have a collective responsibility or individual responsibility to contribute to this collective effort. And I think, Yasmina, I can't say enough how important the work that you're doing with cinema, these sorts of programs that you're doing, it is so important. You are part of this larger continuum, this continuum of Black art, Black intellectual production. Like, you are carrying the mantle in the ways that I think that our ancestors and our elders would want us to carry the mantle. So, yeah, just thank you.
I'm gonna cry. But also, so seriously, in the spirit of how all of them worked, is I do what I do because you do what you do. And I think really, like, there's no getting away from the profound importance of collectivity in all of these histories. And I think also, what I find so beautiful and also so politically powerful in what you said with that kind of ongoingness, that this is what we do for the people who aren't with us anymore. That part of this work of going forward is also this kind of work of mourning. And I think something that I find a bit painful that gets lost because La Noire 2 is such an important film, is so historically essential, is the one African film that you're likely to find on those big top whatever lists, is that I also find it to be an incredibly painful film to watch. Like, to be honest, I'm not always able to watch it through to the end because there's a level of pain and a level of suffering and a level of mourning that is encoded in this. The fact that at the end, this is her out. This is her act of refusal, and it's not to minimize the power that there is in her staking a claim on a kind of life she will not live because it is already a kind of death. And then also it's horrible to watch, and I think it's also really important that as much as this is Sembène's great film and Sembène is a great filmmaker, that the person who I would say is the co-author of this is Msine Thérèse Diop, who is still alive, without whom you cannot imagine this film without her, not just her face, but the physicality, the kind of spiritual work of her performance. And she's someone who doesn't get recognized nearly as much. She's not just an image in this film, she's actually making it.
Yeah, I think one of the frustrations that I have, and we talked about this a little bit backstage, is how her image continuously gets recycled. Like, this is the one image. And it reminds me of sort of, forgive me if I get a little too cultural studies here, but Walter Benjamin's thesis of the mechanical, or the mechanical age of reproduction, when you're continuously reproducing an image, it loses its aura, it loses its essence. Not that Messine Terestrope's essence or aura can ever be lost, but it's this idea of like, if we keep recycling the same image, it sort of flattens the person or flattens the thing. And I think that people need to understand that she was a co-author of this film. This film would not be possible without her. She's not just a beautiful, gorgeous face. She's not just an image, but she is a full-bodied human who is partly responsible for this great masterpiece. And she wasn't a trained actress. I mean, this was, I think she was in fashion school or something. She was not, this was a friend of Sembène's who ended up being a critical part of what we know as the African cinematic canon. Yeah. I think it's time for a question and answer from the audience, so don't be shy.
Hi, thank you so much. You were talking about 2020, Yasmina, and like how you felt really a sense of positivity and sense of potential, and then 5 years later, how did we get here? And something I felt when I was watching Black Girl was, like why, the sense of, so we got independence, it's a good thing, everyone's supposedly happy about that, but then also people don't seem to have any antipathy towards France that's pronounced enough to warn a girl and be like, maybe don't. Everyone, and her mom and dad clearly love her, and that love is expressed in maybe that sense of like, you're a free soul, like, do you, we support what you decide. But that sense of like, I don't know, like, these movies make the world big for us, but like, in a way, like, I can feel, like, I'm so surprised to feel that the world was that small, that there wasn't like a raucous discourse about, where France stands in the memory of Senegalese, like, people, except when she dances on the Independence Monument. I feel like that was the only comment on the meaning of independence. But yeah, like, similarly, like, 5 years, what happened? Yeah, like, I guess, do you think this film has a politics, or is it descriptive? And what was going on, you think, when she was on her first walk and she walked by the government officials? What were they talking, like early in the movie? Like, she's walking by the government officials and they're talking? Oh, word. Well, if you know, maybe you could amplify her response, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the film definitely has a politics that's very much embedded in Sembène's Pan-African Marxist perspective, and I think one of it, which I think is where there's the similarity with Fanon, is that it's this kind of work of exposure of, because part of the way you get from how has so much time passed and how are we still here is if we're disempowered with the kind of knowledge that we need. And I think it's also important that Sembène has his time as a trade unionist. He's someone who is relentless in his commitment that it would actually be possible for us to collectively get ourselves out of this. And Fanon too is such a future-facing writer that all of this is about a commitment to what Amy was saying, this kind of ongoing work of remaking, and in some ways of refusing the kind of the limited future that it seems we have been condemned to by colonization, by white supremacy, by actually just the containment, by refusing that as a border of the kind of world that we can remake. But I think also with a really sobering reminder that it's also really difficult. I don't know if you have anything.
Yeah, all of Sembène's films were entrenched in his politics, and some of his films were like really in your face, calling out colonialism and exposing, you know, the underbelly. I'm thinking of Camp de Charoy, which quite literally talks about the massacre of Senegalese tirailleurs who fought, you know, they fought for the French and they were massacred by the very same French forces that they fought on the front lines for. So yeah, I don't think there's a single Sembène film, and sometimes he'll infuse humor and he'll, you know, they're beautiful films, but he's always going to infuse his politics, and I think this is in the constant remaking, and he's always doing the reminding, he's always doing the teaching, and this is part of this ongoing laying the groundwork that he was so committed to. And just a very brief connection between Sembène and Fanon was just the obvious connection that they were just so committed to their work. And I think watching these films begs the question, like, how far are we willing to go? What are we willing to give up? What are we willing to sacrifice as cultural workers? You know, because Fanon did it to his last breath. You know, Sembène faced censorship. He faced his films being banned in Senegal and Europe, and so they were willing to face the consequences because they understood that the work and the mission was bigger than who they were. Thank you.
Hi. I am kind of confused. I'm trying to, you know, see if I can decipher it myself. In the title of the film, La Noire, deux. If we look at grammar, language, and all that, in French, La Noire deux is like the girl from, the girl of. So I assume that since she was from Senegal, it's La Noire du, that would have been du. I'm not trying to do language, you know, de Senegal. But I'm trying to think with the and the ellipsis at the end, there is something that's more than just that title. I'm trying to think that if the girl was another country that had been colonized by France or other white, you know, countries that have colonized black countries, would the reaction or her way of dealing with it would have been different? And why the and the ellipsis at the end? To me, I'm confused. There's something missing. There's something greater than just the black girl. You know, is there a way you can try to help me out with that? Anyone?
I don't know that I have a final answer, but I think that's a lovely point, because I think that's where we really remember that Sembène was a writer first, and I think he's very much playing with the ambiguity of that. And I think the way I've always read the ellipses is that that's kind of the limbo that she's living in. Like, this is the purgatory that she's been condemned to, is where she doesn't, because she's been uprooted, she's not in a place where she has her family, she's in a social cultural system that she belongs to, she's the Fanon zone of non-being, she's just this kind of in between. But I think also the deux of she belongs to someone, because also this is the colonial tie, because this is supposed to be post-colonial. This is not supposed to be something like slavery or something like colonization in a direct sense, but I mean, show me how these people don't own her, and why is that her only exit from the kind of servitude she's forced into? And I'll be honest, I had never thought about deux as in she could be from another country, but I think where that would definitely work is ultimately, I mean, I'm from Niger, she could be from Niger, she could be from Côte d'Ivoire, she could be from Benin. If she's an African woman in that context, and I think this is where we can also think of the kind of presentness of that incredible effort by hotel workers in Paris, almost all of whom were African immigrant women a few years ago, who organized and changed the possibility of what was ultimately a very similar situation to what she's living through.
And there's a similar movement happening right now in Paris with care workers who work in nursing homes. So that's same. But I agree with your point in that, you know, there's so many Juanas in the world. And so I think Sembène is using la noire with the ellipses as like, this is unfortunately a universal story. This is a story that so many Black women can see themselves in. For, you know, this is a trans-temporal story from the 60s to present day. The domestic workers in so many different countries who are experiencing this zone of non-being that Fanon talks about. Unfortunately, it's still very much a present, palpable reality. And so it does speak to also Sembène's just sheer intelligence with how he plays with language, because yeah, he was first and foremost a writer, and he's very intentional about his tactics and the strategies and motifs that he uses in his work.
Hi, hello. You talked about Sembène being a docker in Marseille. I am from Marseille. What do you think? You know, Claude McKay wrote a book called Banjo, who is happened in Marseille, and talking also about docker and vagabond there. And so I wanted to know what you think, what connection we could do between McKay, Sembène, and Fanon. How can the boss be inspired by Claude McKay? You know, McKay is Jamaican, Fanon is from Caribbean. So what can do connect? How can we connect? And what do you think they were inspired by him? That's the question.
If they were inspired by Claude McKay?
Yeah, what do you think? Maybe you work on them, so do you know if they are connected and if they read and stuff like this?
I don't have a definitive answer. I'm sure there are definitely some shared commonalities between all three. I mean, Claude McKay, we know, was an incredible writer of the Harlem Renaissance who spent time in Marseille. I think what all three of them have in common is that they stepped outside of their immediate surroundings because they understood that there was a need to connect with a broader sense. They needed to connect with a broader sense of a politics of Pan-Africanism. They understood blackness as a global thing and not something that was just in their immediate lives or just in their immediate surroundings. And so I think all three of them understood that there was a need to link arms across waters and across territories and understand that we're all part of this shared struggle. But I'm not a Claude McKay scholar or anything, so I can't really get into granular details. But if you have any observations on what they might have in common.
Yeah, no, but for example, you know, Sembène wrote the Docker Noir, and some people sometimes think he was very inspired by Banjo, because yeah, sometimes it's taking the same story and the same place. So there is a direct connection.
Le Docker Noir, I would say, is like autobiographical. I mean, maybe he might have come across other writers in literature, but Le Docker Noir comes out of Sembène's lived experience.
Yeah, sure, I know that. Yeah, sure, of course.
But it would be interesting to, I don't know, for someone to write about the through line between Claude McKay and Sembène.
Yeah, but we'll talk maybe later after that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Referring to like your point when it comes to like using the archive, my question is, how would one be able to build like a counter archive if the dominant archive has gaps?
Very good question. I think it's about intention, because archive work is memory work, which is care work, and so there's a need to sit with it to understand that whether you're looking through images or letters or clippings, that you're dealing with lived experiences, you're dealing with people. So first and foremost, I think it's about how you're coming to the archive. I think, like for me, I come to the archive as an African woman, so I'm always engaging with an African archive, and so I'm thinking about culture, tradition, history, certain sensitivities, and how I'm trying to connect with what I'm engaging with. And so I think it's about not trying to replicate some of the harm that the West or Europeans might inflict when engaging with the archive, and just trying to have an intentional practice, and know that it's slow work, it's care work, it requires time and intention and integrity.
Thank you.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it there, but sorry. Okay, there will be many more Q&As and many more screenings to come. The next screening of yours, Yasmina, is on October 21st, so please join us for that. And please give a round of applause to Amy Sall and Yasmina Price. And also, you can get Amy Sall's book in the bookstore now, and have her sign it if you would like. So yeah, have a good night.